Hey there, welcome to Palmyra Studios Sewing Tutorials. Today I'm going to show you how to replace a button on your favorite jacket or shirt. So let's get started.
Okay, so let's talk about the supplies you're going to need. I'm going to go through this slide pretty fast, but feel free to pause the video and take a screenshot so you can write down everything you're going to need. So in addition to the garment and the buttons, you're going to want thread, scissors, a needle, marking tools, and a ruler. If you only need a single button, what you're going to want to do is check the care label on the inside of the shirt. This is usually on the left side and it'll be on the very last tag. Sometimes a manufacturer will include an extra button just in case one falls off. If you need multiple buttons, I recommend getting a standard shirt or jacket button from a Sewing Notion store. And the other item I want to highlight on this screen is that I like to use a 2-inch embroidery needle instead of the standard sharp needle. I prefer to use an embroidery needle because it's made of a thicker metal, and what I found when using a standard sharp needle is that it often bends when I'm doing the repetitive up and down motion. This is just a personal preference that I have that I wanted to mention in case it also helps you. Okay, moving on. This slide is to just give you a general overview of the overall process. For preparation, I'm not going to walk you through steps 1 and 2. As with any sewing project, best practices is to press the garment beforehand. I already did that before I started recording. And you're also going to want to thread your needle. If you're not sure how to do it, feel free to check out the video I have on my channel. So for this video, we're going to move straight into the button placement. And then once we go over where to make the markings, we'll start with the actual sewing of the button. Okay, so moving on to button placement. If I'm sewing multiple buttons onto a button placket, I'm always going to start at the top of the shirt so I can make sure that it's evenly placed across the entire length. However, for this video, I'm just going to start here with this broken button for simplicity's sake. So I normally measure button placement in one of 2 ways. If my button is completely missing, I'm going to take my ruler and measure the distance between the 2 buttons above this one. So measuring between these 2 buttons, the distance is showing us 4.5 inches. I then like to visually check it to make sure that that seems reasonable. You know, of course, in this case, I see a button there, but generally I find that this is helpful to make sure that I'm actually marking the correct place. Now, if your button is hanging on by a thread, which is what is happening in my case, you can do the second method. So I'm going to take my scissors and cut the thread, and while I'm doing this, I'm going to be very careful not to cut the actual fabric, only the thread on top. So in my particular case, my shirt is made out of a natural fiber, and so it has a lot of memory to it, which is very helpful because I can see exactly where the previous button was. This makes it so much easier. Of course, you can still measure to make sure that you have the right distance, but in this case, it's not really necessary. So taking my marker, I'm going to mark the middle of that little square, and I'm going to be very careful to not press too hard onto the fabric. Okay, so to start sewing the buttons onto the shirt, I'm going to take a needle that I've already threaded and go to the front side of my shirt. This is a little counterintuitive because usually when we're sewing, we're going to want to hide the knot on the interior of the shirt. However, because of the way we're going to sew it, we're actually going to completely cover the knot with the button and it will help make it more secure. So I'm going to take my needle, and that mark we just made, I'm going to push my needle through it. This will be the center of our button. Something you're going to want to be mindful of is the amount of tension we have in our hands. When you're dealing with a lot of thread length, it's very easy for it to knot. If your thread does become knotted, most of the time this means you're going to need to cut it and restart. So just make sure you always have a good amount of tension in your hands. I'm then going to pass the needle up through the fabric again and then back down. This creates a little anchor for the button. I'm then going to pass the needle up through the fabric again. In terms of placement, I'm going to go below the knot, but you can start on any side. I like to think of the button as a compass, so in this case I'm starting on the south side. Double checking that your thread is fully pulled through so it doesn't knot, you're going to grab your button and you're going to pass the needle from the underside through one of the holes. Then you're going to pass the needle through the other side. So in this case, I'm going from south to north. I'm then going to pull the needle through the fabric going from the exterior to the interior. Usually when I'm doing this one after the other, I like to hold the button on the fabric with my thumb and my middle finger. And after I pass through the button, I can just go straight through the fabric. But in this case, I wanted you to see what I'm doing, so I'm doing it in 2 separate steps. So then I'm going to sew the button laterally. So I'm going to come up from the east side, coming from the interior, and then once I pass through it, I'm going to come back down on the west side. I'm then going to repeat both steps that I just did. So I'm going to go from south to north and then east to west one more time to make sure the button is really secure. Okay, so now that I've done that twice, I'm going to check the button. As you can see, it has a good amount of tension keeping it in place, but there's some room for improvement, which is exactly why we're not done yet. So for this next part, I'm going to pass the needle through the underside of the fabric, going to the exterior of the shirt near the base of the button. Let me get a little bit closer so you can see better. So I'm not going through any of the buttonholes. I'm just pulling the needle so it's above the fabric but underneath the button. Once I pulled the needle all the way through, I'm going to wrap the thread around the button like this. I usually do this about 4 or 5 times. Then I'm going to take my thread, and this time I'm going to make a knot around the base of the button. You're going to do this 2 times. Doing these extra steps really helps anchor the button, but it also makes it easier because it will slightly lift the button off the fabric, which will make it easier when it's going through the hole on the other side. Then I'm going to go a little above where I just was. Next, I'm going to push the needle all the way through the button dome we just created. This can be a little tricky and hard to pull through. So again, I'm just passing the needle through the button base. Then I'm going to cut the loose threads, being mindful not to cut the fabric, and then it's done. It's much more secure because we reinforce the base, and once we give it a good press, it's going to look really beautiful. But of course, be mindful not to touch the button with the iron because it's plastic and it will melt. Thanks for joining me for this sewing tutorial. I'm going to go ahead and finish up the rest of these buttons so my partner can wear this shirt tomorrow to work. See you next time.